If you want to be a successful leader, watch other people around you who you respect as a leader, and no kidding, take notes and think about what fits my style and how can I leverage what I've seen to make me more successful.
Brett, first and foremost, thank you very much for taking time out of what I know is a very busy schedule to be here and to share some thoughts with us. And maybe the best place to start is with your son. Congratulations.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. Yeah, as you know, I pinned the same wings on him 2 weeks ago that my grandfather pinned on me 34 years ago when I graduated from pilot training. And my wife was in the Air Force for 20 years, I was in for 33 years, and now my son's off to fly the F-16, and so continuing that Air Force legacy in the family is pretty special to us.
Well, I forget if it was on LinkedIn or where it was, but I saw the picture, and it's just like, those moments are just so special. And maybe the best place to, kind of jump into this would be interested in hearing about your grandfather and your legacy and just kind of how you got into, the Air Force and just sort of an overview of your career, because obviously it's pretty incredible. Maybe just walk us through that if you can.
Absolutely. And my grandfather never flew in the Air Force. He bought an airplane right at the end of World War II. Back then, like you could buy Jeeps wrapped in Cosmoline, he bought a Piper Cub. And so he flew that airplane for quite a while. And then, I don't know, someplace as I was growing up, I decided at first I wanted to be a lawyer. And then I said, I don't really want to be a lawyer. I think I want to be a pilot. And so I still haven't been able to identify the guidance counselor that said, well, you ought to apply for an Air Force scholarship and you ought to apply to go to Duke. And I did both of those, and I ended up at Duke with an Air Force scholarship and met my wife at Duke. We both commissioned right after graduation. My wife, Mary Ann, served 20 years. She retired as a lieutenant colonel, and then I spent 33 years in the Air Force.
I'll be darned.
So most of that time, 28 years, I was an F-15 pilot. I worked my way up through the various levels of command, and in my final command, I had the privilege of commanding our largest combat wing in Okinawa, Japan, the 18th Wing, at an airbase called Kadena, which was an interesting job. About 9,000 people in the wing doing all the things you have to do to run a wing. At the same time, we had essentially a town of 25,000 on the base, so I was the mayor, the chief of police. We were surrounded by 3 towns that really didn't want us in Okinawa, so a lot of political dimensions to that. So, but a really terrific job. We loved being in Japan, and getting to know the Japanese was great.
Wow.
Then one day I get a call that says it's time for you to leave Kadena, and you're going to go join the IT, comm, and communications, command and control, and cyber world. And so I spent the last 5 years of my career working in primarily cybersecurity and helping to form what is essentially the operating construct and the force structure and the budget that United States Cyber Command is now pursuing to defend our nation in cyberspace.
Wow, and you were eminently qualified for that position.
Oh, absolutely. I had a 1981 computer science degree from Duke that you could do the whole thing on your wristwatch now, but it was a great leadership experience, going from being a wing commander, being an operational commander, doing all of those sorts of things. Had a lot of opportunity to do a variety of combat missions in Southwest Asia, and now I'm with a group of folks who are looking at me going, why are you our new leader? You've got wings on. Can't one of our own people good enough?
Yeah.
And so that's kind of started my leadership experience, and with moving from something that I was very comfortable and very familiar with into something that was a completely new, if you will, set of operations and set of tasks and those sorts of things. But what I very quickly figured out, and something that I've carried with me, is that leadership is technology agnostic. And the things that made you a good leader that got me to that point in my career, I didn't need to change because I was now working in a completely different line of business, if you will. And so over the last 7 or 8 years, as I've had the chance to do some speaking, and now almost 3 years in the private sector, I see all of that is exactly the same.
Well, I'll tell you, we'll come back to that a number of times, I'm sure, but do you remember the first thought you had in your career about leadership? Like what it was, who you identified with as being a leader? Maybe it was formal training, maybe it was just sort of some informal recollection, but the first time you were like, Wow.
That's a leader.
Yeah.
I spoke at my son's pilot training graduation. I told this story. I said, remember, there's certain things that are kind of seared in your memory as you go through your life. And I remember it was at Luke Air Force Base in Phoenix, Arizona. I had gone through all my training. I'd gotten to my first operational squadron, and now we were off on our first training deployment because we were assigned in Florida, and now we were in Phoenix, Arizona, flying a combat training mission. And it was one of those very clear mornings just after sunrise, and I'm taken off on the wing of our squadron commander, a guy named Lieutenant Colonel Joe Gorecki, Gork, Vietnam fighter pilot, all those sorts of things. And we're taking off, and I can still remember that, how excited I was to be flying with the squadron commander. And he was the type of commander that everybody in the squadron wanted to fly with. And I assumed that was the norm. And what I found out as I went through my career is that there's no bad commanders. There's nobody that comes in thinking, I'm going to do whatever I can to make life miserable for the people in my squadron today. But commanders that really inspire you, that motivate you, commanders that you want to be on their wing. I've got some of those things that we've talked about. They've got that legitimate leadership aspect, but they also have that expertise that you want to learn from. And I think the term is referential, that when you kind of roll all of that together, and after our conversation earlier when we talked about that, I really started thinking about that. Cliches are cliches because they're true, but the kind of people that, you'll fly through the gates of hell and do whatever they say needs to be done.
Yeah.
And so what I encourage those new lieutenants to do is that when they see that commander that's like that, is pay attention. Pay attention to what they do. Why is it that you're inspired by them? Why is it that you want to fly on their wing? Why is it that you want to be around them and learn from them? And I think that's really sticks in my mind as the first leader who has said, okay, I want to be like that. And there were several things I took away from that as I went through my career.
It's interesting you're mentioning some of those terms. I know we've chatted about them casually, but a lot of people think of leadership in the context of power. And our founder, Dr. Hersey, kind of defined leadership as an attempt to influence and power as influence potential. And there's really these three main subsets to power, and one is legitimacy. Right. It's like you're the commander, you're in charge, And the others are more on the personal power side of things. It's like, do I respect, you might be in charge, but do I respect your level of expertise? And again, we'll get back to your cyber command, because while in the context of your service to the country, your ability to fly an F-15, might have distinguished you, when all of a sudden you're, kind of get a lateral promotion, if you will, and you're in charge of cybersecurity. Right. Why this guy? So the whole idea of expertise. And then the other kind of the T word thing, the whole trust aspect, the referent power thing, right. Do I want to be like this person or aspire to be something like them? Those are kind of three key components to things. I think the other thing you mentioned that's really important is most people in leadership positions, they don't set out to screw things up, right? They don't send out to like, kind of disturb engagement or these other things. They have the best of intents. But what common mistakes from your career, did you see people in positions of leadership making that really were correctable mistakes? So things, they were promoted into a position of legitimacy, let's say, and their command or their tenure didn't go as well as it could have because they did what?
I think there's a couple of trends. I think that it's kind of a joke, but it's kind of true, is that people get to a certain position, like they send you to a class when you first get promoted to general, and one of the first things they tell you is that, hey Sam, congratulations, you're now a general. You are no better looking and no funnier than you were before, okay? So just remember that. So I think as people, particularly as they get more senior and they get into these legitimate positions of power, that they think that is sufficient. And that is not sufficient. You still have to prove your value to the organization. You still have to earn the trust of your subordinates. And particularly as you get more senior, you have to understand that, I saw this in the wing I commanded. I was a one-star general. I had 5 subordinate colonels that worked for me. Now they all had to do what I said, but how they did that and how they pursued those goals was going to be based a lot on the relationship I could develop with them, the trust that we could have. And so while there is kind of that hierarchical leadership, I think you're really effective if, one of the terms I've heard is called peer leadership, if you will, where we're working side by side to try to get to the same goal. And you saw that very much if you work in the Pentagon. You know, in the Pentagon, I was a 2-star general working over here. I had no direct influence over these other 3 or 4 2 or 3-star generals, no legitimate power, if you will, over them. But I absolutely had to be able to work with them and convince them and persuade them that we had common objectives, common goals, and those sorts of things. So I think one aspect of it is certainly realizing that legitimate power is not sufficient. I think a couple of other ones that stick out frequently to me is, I usually phrase it as, what I said is not nearly as important as what you heard. And so the ability to really fight for feedback, right? Particularly when you get to a large organization. You know, some studies say that really you can only directly influence 6, 7, or 8 subordinates, right? In fact, I got this question, I had the opportunity, we were talking earlier about, I was out at Duke's Fuqua School of Business a couple of weeks ago talking leadership. One of the questions was, you can only influence 7 or 8 people. How do you run an organization of 9,000 people? And I said, well, a lot of it's about communication, and a lot of it is realizing that what you said is not as important as what they heard. And so you really have to work to get down in those layers of the organization and walk around and spot check and say, hey, how are things going? You know, you don't go ask them, hey, did you hear what I said last week in our commander's call? What you have to do is talk to them about their job, talk to them about how things are going, talk to them about, do you feel comfortable that you have the resources you need, all of those sorts of things, and you'll start to get that feedback. Is my message getting out? Am I setting the organizational culture that I want in the organization? But you can't trust that just because you said it, that people necessarily believe it. And so communicating and then being able to demonstrate when you do hear something that says, you know, that is not what I intended and not what I wanted, making sure that you make a change, and it's a change that people see that, hey, the boss listens and the boss actually changes. And I think the third one, and this kind of lines up with some of the things Marshall Goldsmith has in his books, is the way I phrase it is never discount the possibility that somebody else has a good idea, right? And so when you're sitting at the head of the table, you know, and you've got 6 or 7 or 8 of your senior folks around there, and nobody's asking any questions, nobody's giving you any pushback, everybody's just kind of nodding north and south.
Yeah.
Something's probably not quite right with the environment that you have set. And so it's really important, I think. So I think those 3 things is legitimate power, is particularly in the military, that's where you start with, but it is not sufficient. There's plenty of people that have had legitimate power positions and have not been successful. And I think that communication and building that trust, and then I think listening, right? That other people have good ideas. And you know, one of the things I think about is, you know, if we've got an objective that I want you to get to, if I tell you, Sam, here's what I want you to do. We're going to this objective. I want you to do A, I want you to do B, I want you to do C, I want you to do D. And that's not really how you see getting to the objective. And so what I want to do is I want to hear how you want to get to the objective. And maybe you want to do X, Y, and Z to get to the objective. Maybe I think, you know, if I did A, B, and C, and D myself, I would probably get us there, but this is Sam's job.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to be better off by letting Sam take the road he wants to go. Because if he tries to do it my way, he doesn't own it. He's probably not going to do it quite as well, and we may get an 80% solution.
Yeah.
Or if I let Sam do it his way, as long as it's clear that he has my vision, he understands the objective, he understands where I want to go, he's got the competency, right? He's got my support, and we'll probably get a 95% solution at the end of the day.
Yeah.
So I think those are some of the things that stand out to me.
Yeah, so many things to follow up on there. I hope they don't come out jumbled, but the first thing, and one of the most recent things you mentioned, is you know, kind of like Marshall's work, and I think, you know, both his books, What Got You Here Won't Get You There, and also Triggers, are 2 of the best I've ever read. But the whole premise of What Got You Here Won't Get You There is just that.
Yep.
You know, there's so many people in leadership positions within organizations that sort of get to a certain level and they figure out, or they think the reason they got there is because they were the straw that stirred the drink. And to get from here to an executive capacity, it's really about engaging others, and you know, you agree on the what, but the how becomes much more less dictated by your own personal experience and more dictated by, by their engagement. The other thing you're talking about with the Duke students that were questioning you, you can really only impact 7 or 8 people. I mean, I flash on a program that we have. It's been successful, with us at the Center for Leadership Studies for literally decades. That Dr. Hersey used to use, personally, was 12 O'Clock High, which I'm got to be familiar with, right?
Right.
You were playing the role of Gregory Peck in real life. But the whole idea when he took over the 918th Bomb Group, he recognized that his message to the group was one thing, and that was really pretty structured. But his message with Jesse Bishop, who was one of the informal leaders of that 918th Bomb Group, that was something different. And that if he could convince Bishop to sort of see his vision, Bishop would take care of it, with people that he didn't have direct access to. And that whole idea of leadership as kind of a game of chess versus checkers, I think really distinguishes people that might be really strong, first level supervisors, versus dealing through 2 or 3 layers to get something done.
Yeah. Just as I've read more and more about situational leadership, by the way, when I first met you and I told my wife, Mary Ann, I said, so I met the guy, he's married to the daughter of Dr. Hersey. I said, situational leadership. She goes, yeah, I remember that. She said, because, in the military, at about the 3 or 4 year point, you go to something called Squadron Officer School, because it's the first formal leadership training you have, and situational leadership was one of the things we were talking about the other day. Oh, she goes, oh yeah, it's directing, it's coaching. I mean, this is stuck very clearly in her mind, and I won't say exactly how many years it was since she was a captain, but it's been a couple of decades. And so I was going to mention that to you, that that immediately came to her mind. But as you think about the different situations and all of those sorts of things that go into the model, back to your point, loyalty is the one that I think is key to dealing with that situation you highlighted from 12 O'Clock High. Because one of the things I think about is, I call it the beg forgiveness, don't ask permission. If I could sum up everything I think about leadership, it's in beg forgiveness, don't ask permission. I want you to feel like that, look, you've got a lane in the road. The more senior you are, the fuzzier the sides of the lane are. Here's the objectives. Go figure out how to get there. And I think that's how most people want to work. Now, if you're in my office begging forgiveness 3 times a week, then maybe you need to ask permission a little bit more often. But I told those students that I had applied that from the first organization I commanded, about 350 people, all the way up through those, and then the big executive staff positions if I had. And I never got burned. But what has to make it work is kind of from the 12 O'Clock High example, there's a loyalty piece to this, and it's a 2-way loyalty piece. And one part of it is, if I'm going to empower you to do what needs to be done, operate in your lane, make decisions, do things, if you do make a decision that I don't agree with, unless it's unethical, immoral, or illegal, then I'm going to do everything I can not to change that decision, because I want everybody that works for you to see that Sam, hey, he's got delegated authority from the boss. He makes decisions, he gets things done, and then we talk about it. So the next time the situation comes up, or a similar situation, that we're going to have a discussion about it. But the other side of that is your loyalty to me, and I have to set an environment that makes it work in the way I'm about to describe, where I don't expect you, especially when we're talking senior leaders. I don't expect you to just blindly go out and do what I want to do. Back to our earlier thing, if I'm not getting pushback and discussion in the right environment, then something's not right. But once we've all said, okay, the discussion's been had, this is the direction we're going, then I need you to go out and execute against that direction. And I've seen times in my career, and at first I corrected it too late, and later on I figured you can't let this fester. If I've got any kind of sense that what you're doing is walking out of the office and going, the boss has got another stupid idea, but here we go. Right? I also don't expect you to walk out the office and go, hey, the boss has a brilliant idea, because your folks will know. But you can go out of the office going, here's what we're doing, team, here's where we're going, here's our objectives, here's how we're doing it, here's why we're doing it. But for you to be able to do that, I've got to create an environment where we can have a discussion, and we can get to the point where you feel free to ask, okay, well, why are we doing that? I don't understand that, and we'll have enough of a discussion where you can see my logic, you don't necessarily agree with maybe this objective at this time, but you see enough of the logic where you can go, this is not the way I do it. But again, going back, Marshall's got so many good things, is who's the decision maker, right?
Yeah.
And so if I'm a smart decision maker, I'm gonna get all of these inputs, we're gonna have all of this discussion in the right room, and then once the decision's made, we're gonna execute. And then you've gotta decide, okay, it wasn't my decision, but I understand why we're doing it, and I can support this, and I will support it, and I'll go on and do it. But you can't agonize over the fact that you're not the decision maker.
I think sometimes one of the hardest things, most difficult things to do in leadership is it's easy to accept or to understand, but to really come to grips with the whole idea that leadership is this multi-directional thing, right? So certainly it applies from you as the boss influencing people that report directly to you. There's certain orders you give that need to be obeyed, whether you're in private sector or you're an Air Force pilot, right? The whole idea when you're talking about your Pentagon experience, leadership is also influencing peers where you have no legitimate power. And a big part of it, it's also having the intestinal fortitude, the guts, whatever you want to call it, to effectively influence your boss, to challenge up, to say things. And I think it's very indicative of good leaders. It's like, if there really isn't disagreement, if you're not getting some sort of pushback, especially if you're making big decisions, if you're it's really your responsibility to stir that pot. But just to think that what you've got is 6, 7 heads nodding and you've come to the right decision, usually there's trouble, right around the corner there. But that's a difficult thing, to build in. In your experience, how comfortable are people challenging up? Because you have a tendency to think of, military organizations, wherever they happen to be, is, well, here's the order. My job is to follow the order, right? But how much constructive criticism or pushback did you experience in your military career versus, let's say with your civilian transition?
Yeah, I've seen the same dynamic in the private sector that I saw in the military, is that I think once you get above, I don't know, let's call it in the military, it'd be kind of that major, that 04 level, you've kind of come out of what we call the company grade, you're in the field grade. What I've seen in the private sector is once you become really that, first time you're a manager, that you have to fight to make sure that people believe you when you say, hey, I want feedback. I want to know when you have a problem with what I'm doing, because our objective is not to make Brett or Sam successful. Our objective is to make the organization successful. One of my favorite Coach K quotes is, you got to play for the front of the jersey, not the name on the back of the jersey, right? And so people have to believe that. And I think that it doesn't matter private sector or military, that the more senior you get, the harder it is for you to get the pushback, because people are worried about their careers, they're worried about, how is this going to reflect on me, those sorts of things. And so it's up to you as the leader to create the environment, especially with those 6 or 7 that you do influence, because the bigger your organization is, the more critical they are, because they influence the next 6 or 7. If you don't have alignment down there, then you're going to have some serious problems. And so we've got to have an environment where we can do that. So you really have to fight for that feedback, and you've really got to create that environment to make sure that loyalty goes both directions.
It's reciprocal. Yeah.
Exactly. But you can kill it right in a second. And so I would look for opportunities. I'd be sitting at the table and say, hey, we're going to do this, and here's the direction I want to go after looking at this, blah, blah, blah. And I would look for opportunities if somebody came up with and said, hey, boss, I think, da, 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 da. If I could use that person's method of doing something, or if I could say, actually that is a much better idea, we're going to do it that way. I know it's going to give me the objective the same way, but that starts to create that environment where, hey, the boss does want to hear the truth, and they do want to hear, other options for doing that.
Yeah.
The other piece that I learned, really not till I got to the Pentagon, it kind of goes back to a previous thing we were talking about, is I showed up at the Pentagon as a 2-star general, is that I found out there were a lot of decisions made by 4-star generals that never got carried out, right? There's a lot of bureaucracy, there's a lot of things in there that are going on that just because the 4-star said it, not all of that stuff happened. And you just have to realize that that's what the situation is. And if it didn't happen, it's probably because maybe it wasn't a good idea, or maybe, or there could be just evil people in there that are trying to block it, but not everything they said happened. And so one of the things that, a lesson I learned early on, it's another one of these, one was more fun about flying, but here's another one. I remember one of the jobs I had in the Pentagon was Air Force readiness. So we had to report, are we ready to do our combat mission? Are we ready to do these things? And when I first got into that job, I'm looking at the data, I'm looking at things here, and I'm going, this is very thin. We do not have a good cause and effect relationship, which is really dangerous because you're putting a lot of money into this pot thinking it'll produce this result. And the data wasn't there to say, hey, we're putting the right money in the right. What we're doing is we were measuring stuff that's easy to measure. We weren't making sure that linkage was connected. So I went to give a readiness briefing to 4-star Chief of Staff of the Air Force and the Secretary of the Air Force, so 2 most senior people in the Air Force. And I basically went through our reporting system, and not quite this bluntly, but I said, we are completely screwed up. Our logic doesn't match here. We don't have a good idea on where the money's going. Are we measuring the right things, right? Because if you don't measure the right thing, you could turn the dot green, but not achieve your objective. And I got done with that, and the Chief of Staff, who's one of my mentors still today, he said, E.T., that was my call sign. And as a fighter pilot, there are many people who didn't know your real first name. And he goes, E.T., I don't think we need a lecture on how the readiness system works and blah, blah, blah. So basically, bam, right? And so I thought, geez, But then I learned that every good idea has a gestation period. And so you've got to let it fester. And no kidding, about 6 months later, my boss, who was a 3-star, came into me and goes, E.T., I just came out of this meeting and the secretary said almost exactly what you said 6 months ago, right? And so your ability to convey these ideas in the right way up the chain, to accept the fact that they may not be greeted with great enthusiasm, but if your logic is sound and you continue to support that over time, that you will frequently see that it comes back out the other side.
Yeah.
And as long as we apply we all get more done if we don't worry about who gets the credit, then that can work.
That is a great soundbite. Any really strong idea, there is a gestation period, that it needs to go through, especially if what you're doing is introducing an idea that challenges the system, and to follow it would mean change. So there's that initial pushback, resistance, but by the same token, at the same time, there's also, maybe not outwardly, but inwardly, okay, I don't know that I want to buy into this 100% right now, but I'm going to put this in the incubator and kind of see what goes on with it for a while. Absolutely. Speaking to your military career here, Morten, like what percentage, if there's a way to distinguish it that way, what percentage of what you know about leadership came from formal training like we provide, situational leadership competencies, versus on-the-job training? Seeing somebody that has one particular trait or something that you really identify with, and then just trying to model after that. So there's kind of the informal side to leadership development, and then there's more of the let me introduce you to kind of formalized thinking about. Is there a mix there for you as you reflect on your career? And
to me, certainly most of what I'd say the vast majority of what I learned was OJT, it was trial and error, it was feedback. Marshall relies a lot on the 360 feedback, and I had an opportunity to have one of those when I was a new colonel. So we had some specific leadership training opportunities. And again, we keep referring to Marshall because he's got a lot of good ideas, but it was just like he said, we can go in and have a 1-hour session, a 1-day session, we could have a 3-day seminar, but if you don't go out and apply that, right, and put it in some kind of a structure that you're really gonna take those concepts and figure out how to apply them to your leadership experience, then you aren't going to get anything out of that. And so there's a couple of times that I did have some specific leadership training. One I remember in particular was when I was at that wing in Okinawa, and we all came to a commander's conference, and in Hawaii was where the headquarters was. You would think that would be a really good deal. We didn't get outside that much. But we did 2 days on, really what it was about was how do you take your organization, which is by design almost pretty stovepiped. You know, I've got an operations group that flies the airplanes. I got a maintenance group that maintains the airplanes. I got a civil engineering group that keeps all the facilities. I got a mission support group that does all the education and personnel and runs the dining halls and all of that kind of stuff. And it's very easy to let them operate in their stovepipe, right, and be successful in their stovepipe, but you aren't successful to the overall mission. And so that was a significant leadership training experience for me, because I took it back to the wing and I started to apply it. And this was a question I was going to ask you. You know, you talk about situational leadership that's really guided at, you know, that first or second level of formal or legitimate leadership. How do you transition, give you some kind of model to work from? And as I was thinking about, I took this from this commanders conference, I took it back to the wing, and it was one of these things where we called it strategic alignment and distribution. So essentially, I wanted to sit down and go, okay, what is the real purpose of this wing? What is our overall vision? What's our mission? All those sorts of things. And so now I'm talking to these 5 colonels who are all busy. They don't have time for this stuff, right? And so as I was thinking about our discussion today and thinking about the leadership model, going from you know, directive, telling, to coaching, to supporting, participating, and down to delegating, is that my leadership style, the more senior I got, the more I wanted to be in that delegating thing. Mm-hmm. And so this was my question for you. As I thought about that experience of taking this back, I brought in a facilitator, I made them sit in a room for 2 days and really think about what this was. And it was really hard for them to be loyal back up the chain and support this. So while I completely delegated to them the running of their groups, mm-hmm. as I started thinking about, you know, I'm very much on that directive side, low competence because I haven't really thought about how to do this. You know, I've been through this training session, it crystallized in my brain immediately what I wanted to do. But I felt like over the course, and it took 8 or 9 months, and I'll tell you how I knew when I was successful, but I felt like at different times I was working through all 4 quadrants of that, you know, because some people would start to get on board, other people wouldn't get on board. And so I'd be curious to your thoughts on that, because the way I knew that it had finally caught on, and I call it leadership stamina, I had to continue to drive this, force people to report these metrics. I'm not claiming to be where Alan Mulally is, but it was a similar kind of thing where I said, you know, like the famous story about his meeting where, hey, we're going to meet every week and we're going to put these metrics up, and it's cross-functional. I'm not so interested in what you're doing, I'm interested in how the team's doing and how your part is contributing to that. And if you have problems, I want to know about it, you know, and the whole story about, you know, all those things went on in there. And so this was a similar situation, but when I say leadership stamina, I had to keep driving this until it wasn't when one of the colonels came back, but below the colonels there were 28 lieutenant colonels that ran each of the squadrons. And I always had a meeting once a week with all 28 of them. And one of them stood up and started showing slides and talking about how he had reorganized his squadron, you know, same thing, looking very cross-functionally, lining up to the wing goals and all that kind of stuff. And, you know, I just wanted to applaud because I knew, and that was the most powerful message. You know why? Because all the other squadron commanders, they could listen to me say it all day. But when they see Sam applied these concepts to his squadron and he said it's working for him, mm-hmm. then all of a sudden they go, maybe there's something to that.
Maybe there's something to this,
So do you see that as you go higher, that situational leadership model, it's kind of like in one aspect of my relationship with you, leader to subordinate, we're kind of operating over in the delegating quadrant, but over here, I'm still trying to get your support. I'm trying to bring you on board. All that is that correct?
Absolutely. The higher you go in an organization, a condition for those promotions has something to do with demonstrated ability and willingness. Mm-hmm. You know, you're good.
Right.
You're good at something. You value, you know, being a leader, a formalized leader in the organization. So the higher you went, you know, in the organization, you know, the more you would rely on, you know, style 3 and style 4.
Right.
You know, it's much more of a participative, delegative thing. But as you've already said, you know, to use your own words, if you're going out to your key staff and you're saying, where are we? And you're getting nothing but agreement, that makes you nervous.
Right.
You then are challenging them more to make sure that they're applying the critical thinking that they need to be applying. And we used to really target most of our situational leadership training, and still do for the most part, at, you know, the first jump. Like mm-hmm. when you go from being, you know, an athlete to a coach for the first time, right? So you're an individual contributor and you're really successful, and that's, you know, 70% of the reason you get promoted is because you're good at your technical job. 80% of the reason you struggle is because you were good at your job.
Right.
You just feel like everybody should do things the way you do them. So what we try to teach people or say, here's the benefit of situational leadership that's grounded in this foundational organizational behavior, leadership development science, is, it depends. There's no such thing as a bad style. Delegation works, participation works, direction works. It's all a question of when you do what. And probably the most inconsistent thing you can do is to treat everybody the same.
Right.
Because it's ridiculous to assume that everybody's going to greet every task, with the same amount of knowledge, experience, skill, confidence, commitment, and motivation. Of course, there's going to be variability there. So if you want to move those folks along that continuum, you're going to have to differentiate what you do on the basis of who you're leading. What Alan did at Ford, Alan Mulally, it really sort of opened our eyes to the application of situational leadership in a board type setting. When he came up with his famous, red, yellow, green system, and he was asking key executives, top 16 people at Ford, as he took over the organization, and they were headed for a $17 billion loss, as I understand it. Okay, evaluate your plans in the context of our vision. Green means you got a plan and you're seeing results. Yellow means you got a plan, but you anticipate seeing results, but you haven't seen them yet. And red is, no plan, no results.
Right.
And each of those 16 key executives came back the first time. It speaks a little bit to the culture that Alan took over. Each of those 16 key executives came back the first time and they were all green. And Alan, my understanding, very calmly said, okay, so we're 6 months away from bankruptcy. We're heading for the largest loss in the history that Ford's ever experienced. And what you're telling me is we're all on track. Okay, let's do that exercise again. Right? And finally, Mark Fields emerges from the pack and says, well, if we're telling the truth here, I'm red. I don't know how I got to be red. And it was really a bold move on his part, because culturally at that point in time, that's just not something you did, right? And Alan's response, and Marshall makes a big deal out of it, and he should, Alan's response was just, okay, great, thank you. Now, what are we gonna do? And he credits that moment as much as anything to sort of applying situational leadership, the whole idea of here's somebody that's admitting that they're unable and insecure, that they don't have a plan, that divisionally we're really struggling here. Now what we need to do is get this person some direction. And back to the power stuff for a second or two, the other thing I thought that was amazing about that story was, even though Alan was the CEO and had all kinds of legitimate power, he made a big deal about saying, by the way, I'm an airplane guy. I came from Boeing.
Exactly.
I don't know how to fix your problem. But we have a lot of smart people here at Ford, and we can get some consultants and some other stuff if we need to, but we need to get Mark Fields some direction, and I'm not going to be the one that makes the decision to supply it. Right? So in that moment, okay, he's still got legitimate power, okay, but he's basically building a lot of referent power with people because they're saying, wow.
By acknowledging he has no expert.
I don't know what we're doing here. Even if he did. This is another key point that Marshall makes, and nobody makes it better than him, but he said, what would have happened at that juncture if Alan would have said, well, have you thought of this? Have you tried that? He would have gotten compliance immediately. Given the gravity of the situation, people probably would have said, oh yeah, that's a great idea. And they would have implemented his plan and probably failed. So what he had was the patience to leverage his position, to sort of put it on them and say, if we're gonna get out of this mess, I'll sort of orchestrate it, I'll facilitate it, but I'm not gonna do it. And that's a real key difference, I think, and something that we're in the middle of is investigating. If you're a first line supervisor and you have the answers, like people are seeking your expertise. Part of what you're doing is teaching them how to fly the plane because you know how to fly one because you've flown one forever. You have answers to their technical questions. The higher up you go, the more you're dealing with knowledge workers. And it's not necessarily you need to wait to get to the executive suite these days. We'll talk about your cybersecurity experience. Like you can walk into a room right away, first day as the boss, and be the dumbest guy in the room. Right? So how do you influence people or effectively lead people that are 10, sometimes 100 times smarter than you for that set of circumstances. So it's not as much as that you do situational leadership, you more facilitate it.
Right. Something
You know, and boy, I'll tell you, on a bunch of different planes, that's where we are today. Leaders subverting ego and having the foresight to see my decision is in no way, shape, or form, going to be the best outcome.
Right.
Even if I've got an answer to the plan. What I really need to do is get these folks to align around something they buy into and then move forward. You've mentioned that, a couple of times already.
Yeah. A little story they would always tell in the military, kind of to your point about what if he'd said, I wonder if we ought to do this, is, it's the wing commander that shows up at the wing, everything's looking good. First Saturday he's going to go out and play golf, and he gets to about the fourth hole, and he hits it into that tree right at the corner of the dog leg. And the next Monday morning meeting, he goes, I really enjoyed the golf course. It's in nice shape, He says, that darn tree though on number 4, that thing, is something else. Next week he goes out and plays. There's no tree there anymore. Yeah. Right? So you have to understand what impact your words are going to say. But that whole story around the table to me hits several things. Is one, I'm a big believer in organizational culture, and leadership behavior sets the organizational culture. And if you can set the culture that you want with the appropriate vision and those sorts of things, then you don't have to get mired in the tactical details. There's plenty of people that know how to do that. I think the second thing that he showed there is that you're going to get rewarded for making the team better. And there were a couple of people that weren't going to be on board with that. As I recall in the book, there's 2 or 3 of those senior folks that left. But a lot of that was about creating, if you will, a safe environment for people to admit, that they didn't have the answers. And I think that I've definitely seen that in the military and in the private sector is, can you set a safe environment where people can let you know what's not going right? And then there's an obligation. If Mark Fields was still red, a year later for exactly the same reasons, then he got another issue. But this was an opportunity for him to get help, to interact, to create an environment, and then I'm sure 6 months later, he's providing advice and support for another aspect of the company, and it was that teamwork that they built, I think, that really made that successful.
And again, it's testament, and it's why everybody everywhere is like singing Alan Mullally's praises these days. But can you imagine being a CEO of an organization that's leaving and getting what most people would consider to be a significant exit package in terms of dollars and stocks and those kinds of things? And doing that with a 97% approval rating.
Right.
Boggles the mind.
Yeah, you did
where it's just like, okay, so here's a guy that got a big check, right? And by the way, if it was up to me, I'd have given him more.
Yeah.
I mean, that kind of speaks to the impact of not only what Alan had on the productivity, of like short-term results or success, but also just the engagement of what it was like to be an employee at Ford. To that point, the whole idea of culture and those sorts of things, it's really interesting, like you mentioned at the beginning, where you were a fighter pilot forever and a squadron commander and all those kinds of things. Then all of a sudden somebody said, let's put you in charge of cybersecurity. So here you come, and you go over there, and you have this experience in the armed forces, and you speak about this, and very well, I might add. I've seen a number of your tapes, and I've read an article, but the specifics associated with your advice on cybersecurity sort of, it started with CEOs taking it seriously. From your experience, how could that possibly be, the case in this day and age that you wouldn't be aware of, or take it as seriously as you needed to?
Right. What I've seen is they take it seriously, but they underestimate how far their organization is away from really having a culture that says, and I agree with you, there's a lot of disruptors. Cybersecurity happens to be the big one right now. The technology is the disruptor. I think cybersecurity is a component of technology disruption in the sense that technology is code for plug it into the internet and connect it to everything, and with that comes great benefit, but also it comes with great risks. And business is all about managing risk, right? It's where do I allocate resources in order to mitigate risk, manage risk, do those sorts of things. And so what happens, I think, is people who are at the very senior level, right? They know everything about how the business operates, and they know everything about finance, right? And they know, hey, if I'm the CEO or I'm a director on the board, I've got a question about operations, I know exactly what to ask Sam, and I know if the answer is, shall we say, less than rigorous in the data that backs it up. Same thing, if I got a question about the income statement, I know exactly what to ask the CFO, and I know if the answer makes sense. But if I got a question about IT risk or cybersecurity or cyber risk, I look at the CIO and I go, hey Fred, are we good? Right? And that is completely different. And then the flip side of that is, instead of me making meaningful statements, taking meaningful actions, executing meaningful leadership behaviors, I don't know what those are because I don't know enough about, let's call it cyber risk in this case, for me to do that. So I essentially delegate that to Sam. But when you need to change the culture of an organization to say that every business decision we have, in this case cybersecurity is our example, every business decision we have, whether it's an M&A, a new line of business, whatever it is, if we aren't thinking about cybersecurity and cyber risk and how that impacts this, then that's going to have a strategic impact on our business. Mm-hmm. I can't change that culture by delegating that culture change to the CIO or the CISO. That's got to be me. And so when I go into boardrooms and do these 3-hour sessions, the biggest message I try to leave with them is that, you came in and got to this position because let's just operations and finance. You know a lot about, that's how you run businesses, right? You know nothing about this. But if you're going to be able to ask the right questions, understand the answers, know when things aren't going right, then you're going to have to dig down and learn a little bit about this. And I'll give you a quick example of this. Is when I showed up again at that wing at Kadena, I had a civil engineering group. There's only 5 in the Air Force. Usually you have a squadron, I had a group with squadrons. So there's about 1,800 people, supervise roads, buildings, all that sort of stuff. And so we'd had a runway that had been closed for 6 months while they were resurfacing the runway. And they went out to do some tests, not important what the test is, but they're driving a pickup truck on the runway, and the guy looks down and he goes, you think we ought to be leaving tire marks in this new runway? No, probably not, right? And so it turned out that there had been a number of errors made in the engineering of that. We'd spent several $1 million on it, had it closed for 6 months, huge operational impact. And so I had to go in, and eventually I'm standing over the shoulder of the Japanese contractor, and he's showing me the chart of how much gravel versus how much sand, and here's where the mistakes were made, all that stuff. So it was up to me to deep dive enough into that so that I would know in the future, okay, what are the red flags? What are the questions I should be asking? I don't have to be able to do his job, but I've got to be able to learn enough to know what the red flags are and that sort of thing. Okay. And I think as a senior leader, the first thing I've got to do is I've got to understand the people, those other senior people below me. Do I trust them? Do I think they, But if I have a doubt or if I have a question, when I went to that wing, I knew a lot about operations, a lot about maintenance. I didn't know a lot about civil engineering. I had a 500-person hospital. I didn't know a lot about running a hospital. So those are the areas I went and spent time with, and not just getting the, hey sir, come on over, let's get you on a tour. I spent time sitting next to people asking, what do you do? How does this work? What are the things that cause you problems? All that sort of thing. Same thing when I get into the cyber job. I had to build first empathy with that new team, that they knew that I knew how hard their job was, how little appreciated they were, nobody saw this as important, all that sort of thing. So step 1 was to build that empathy. I think step 2 was to get enough knowledge on my side. I'm not going to do their job and sit down on the keyboard, but this is a completely new field. If I don't learn a couple of levels down what's going on, I don't know what the red flags are, and I'm stuck doing exactly what I said that board member is when he goes, hey Fred, are we good? And you can't afford to do that. So when we're talking about cybersecurity, we're talking about, I think, any other disruption to an organization, you're going to have to take some of your personal time and invest in understanding, okay, what are the dynamics of this? What are some of the key concepts, those sorts of things, so that I can provide the right level of oversight and leadership.
And to me, not unlike the general that made a comment about the tree in the middle of the fairway, right? If it becomes apparent that the CEO, that they're really concerned about cybersecurity, right? And they're doing all this investigation and kind of asking these questions, that word's going to get around, right?
Absolutely.
The trees, somebody's going to be, doing something to the tree. But in situational leadership terms, if you have a CEO and they are not, they don't have knowledge, experience, and skill, they're kind of R1, they're admitting their own readiness, for that task and for the implications of it, their first step, nothing standing in their way obviously, is to get better information so that they can make informed decisions. So as opposed to delegating something you know nothing about,
Right.
right? You're really in the trenches, figuring that out. And also I think adding credibility, to the people that are in that division, to the CIO,
Oh,
whoever else it happens to be.
That's a huge point, Sam, that add credibility, because one half of my job was building credibility with all these knowledge workers, all these cyber people, that this is my favorite team. Whatever team I'm on is my favorite team, and we're going to go out and do this. But because of where I came from, I could go to the other ship drivers, tank drivers, airplane drivers, and I could get into meetings they couldn't get into. See, that's the problem that the CIOs and the CISOs have today, is they want them to come into the boardroom or come into the C-suite and talk in business relevant terms and those sorts of things. And very few CIOs or CISOs, they haven't spent the last 20 years in those meetings. You call them in when the video teleconference doesn't work. You don't call them in to discuss the next acquisition, right? Yet now they're expected to come in and talk about ROI and in business relevant terms. And many of them really struggle to do that. And so, same thing with those folks that were working in the cyber and IT business. They're toiling away. Nobody's helped them connect the dots from what they do to the mission, which is another huge theme of mine, is if you're handing out towels in the gym in Saudi Arabia at our base, you ought to know why what you do every day contributes to airplanes taking off and putting warheads on foreheads, as we used to say. And as a leader, you have to connect people to that. And so, because I could go into rooms and I could talk to these other operators, even if my predecessor had come in and basically said the same type of things, he wouldn't have said it the same way. But now you're going, well, ET's saying it, that must be important, And so I found that to be a huge advantage for me in terms of raising the awareness and moving what I thought was the right agenda forward. But the other effect was, now people started going, hey, we're about to start this important planning meeting, and there's nobody there from the IT and cyber side. We got to hold on and wait till we got to go get one of them. And it wasn't because the video teleconference didn't work. It's because they said this is strategically important to our mission. And so now you got these people who had been toiling away in rooms with no windows. Nobody calls you up and goes, hey, the computer system worked really good today. I appreciate it, right?
I just got on today. I logged on and it was perfect.
This is super. I just want to tell you that, right? Now they've got people calling them and they're calling them because they need their expertise to connect to the mission, right? And so it drove the folks on this side to learn a lot more about this. And then once they learn more about it, they go, I need more information. I need this expertise in the room with me. I need this to be a critical part. And the self-fulfillment, that was probably the biggest personal pleasure I got out of that job, was seeing kind of the chest puffed out and that whole sense of, hey, we're part of the fight here. What I'm saying?
You do a fantastic job of describing both sides of that, right? It's kind of like if you're in a support function and you're not used to speaking business terms, there's a certain amount of it's on you, right? To be able to learn those terms, to be able to make sense in those conversations. So if you allow yourself to sort of be compartmentalized, a certain part of that is on you, okay? And I see, and I saw in your article, there's some real parallels between the IT space, if you will, in the context of the big picture in organizations and the training folks. Training people talk all the time about they want a seat at the big table. Well, the training people that have a seat at the big table, they've earned that. They speak the business's language. They position training in the context of competitive advantage and costs and what it means and how it contributes and all those kinds of things, but they're few and far between. Unless there's that initiative, that leadership being taken on the part of whoever heads up the training organization, most executives are not saying, let's get the training people in here, unless there's a specific special question.
But there's a push and a pull, right? Because there are smart people that work for me when I first got to, it's called the J6 is the organization that does this. And there were smart people in there and they could knock on the door all day long, but until I created a situation where they open the door. So you're right. It's almost like your example of OJT is like I could be a CISO and I could go out and get my MBA at the executive program at night, right? And so, but if I haven't had the experience and I am not had the opportunity to be exposed to, okay, how does this work in the real world, and given an opportunity to let you know that, hey, I know how to fit this in, right? So it's definitely it's initiative on this side, right, to get yourself smart and take advantage of it, and sometimes to knock on doors where people aren't used to having you knock on the door. At the same time, as a leader, you've got to be smart enough to recognize, hey, here's somebody that, hey, this is the basic leadership thing. Hey, here's somebody that's trying to make themselves better and contribute to the team and all of that. How do I mentor, support, make them more effective and integrate them with that?
Yeah.
So I think both those things go in there.
So the whole idea of key executives in organizations that are communicating that cybersecurity is a priority, right? It's certainly their involvement in learning as much as they can learn. There might also be some accountability things, some consequences for non-compliance. And I would imagine if there are some people in an organization or some key folks that lose their jobs because they're not taking these things seriously, that can send a message very, very quickly and very, very specifically. And the other thing you spoke to that I thought was really interesting was, and it probably is what happened to you, if you take high potentials, if you take people that are coming up in your organization that everybody knows is earmarked for great things, significant leadership positions, and you put them in charge of, or you force them into lateral sort of moves within the organization that focus on cybersecurity, that sends, again, a huge cultural message there.
On what's important.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the first piece on accountability, we kind of went right to, okay, if you don't comply, you're going to get fired. To me, there's a big chain before that. One piece is the communication piece. Did I communicate why this is important, and did you receive that message, right? Part two is, leaders inspire, they resource, and then they motivate. And the resource part is, did I give you the knowledge, skills, and abilities to be able to do what it is I expect you to do? And then did I test to see whether my training had been effective? Because I'm huge on the difference between training and exercising. And this is an area that I think clearly there's an advantage in the military, because exercising is such a part of our culture, and we create the environment where the purpose of the exercise is to identify gaps and shortfalls in our training and to be able to correct those. What I've seen in the private sector, what I'm exposed to most is the cybersecurity piece, is they don't create this environment where everybody understands that we're going to create a stressful exercise. It's got to be stressful so you kind of forget you're talking to the CEO as you're going through this. And it's also got to be where at the end of it, we identify gaps that Sam has in being able to execute, or that the company has. It's not going to reflect on Sam, it's going to reflect on us. We didn't give you the knowledge, skills, and abilities to be able to do what it is we expect you to do. Now, if the third exercise down the road, Sam's still making the same mistakes, then we've got another issue. But once we've done that, once we've communicated what this is, why it's important, what our expectations are, I do the training, give you knowledge, skills, and ability to be able to do that. I validate that my training was good, right? Then I got to hold you accountable, right? Because everybody in your company is held accountable. And, depending on the industry, how much it's regulated, all of that stuff, but that accountability speaks very large. The example I used to give, there have been maintenance personnel, aircraft maintenance personnel, who have been held accountable under the Uniform Code of Military Justice and been removed from the service, have done time incarcerated because they didn't follow proper maintenance procedures that could put an airplane or a crew or a pilot at risk, right? And you can find analogies of that in every business. But how often do you see people strategic risks to the business based on your individual behavior on the network? Or if you get egregious, there's people that sell their passwords, all sorts of things. But you're right, at some point I've got to hold people accountable for those activities. And then that starts to send a message that, hey, this is serious business. And then the other piece, I've had this discussion with folks in the private sector. I go, have you thought about taking that 30-year-old business unit leader that is just kicking butt and making him the deputy CIO for 3 years? Oh, we can't do that, that'd ruin his career. I said, you got to be kidding me. Every article you see says, we need board members that understand this. We need CEOs that understand this. 10 years from now, when it's time for him to compete to be the COO, don't you think it'd be pretty valuable for him to have that perspective? I mean, have been immersed in that, to really understand how hard it is to do this job, what are all the cultural barriers that you're fighting out there? I mean, he's going to have or she is going to have a completely different view of that. Mm-hmm. So I think as a leader, you can set the environment that says that's important. So that's another part of your accountability. But this is why we take this seriously. We're taking Sam, who had biggest sales numbers in the company over the last 3 years, and now he's going to go over and he's going to be the deputy CIO, right? And before I do that, though, I've got to know Sam's he sees this as important, he's going to take it on, he's going to invest his time to get smarter in it, and that he has the basic leadership skills that it takes to be just as effective over there as he is over here in this sales organization.
And it's something he's passionate about. And
Right. Or can get passionate about. Yeah. I wasn't super passionate when they first told me, but as I got into it and I realized the importance of it, I was super passionate. And which takes me to maybe one of the final points I would at least like to make that hasn't come up yet, and you kind of talked about the OJT leadership versus this.
Yeah.
Is that as I went through my career, first 8 or 10 years you're flying a fighter and you're very happy with, I'm doing better, I'm becoming a flight lead, an instructor pilot. I go to the Air Force's weapons school, kind of the version of Top Gun, only much more difficult. But I'm doing all these things. And then at some point I woke up one day and go, you know what I really enjoy? Is I enjoy teaching Sam to fly. I am finding that I get a lot of pleasure in how well Sam is flying. And then you go on and you start getting in these different leadership positions, and then I had an opportunity in the Air Force to mentor. We do a week-long session when you're selected to be a wing commander. You go to Maxwell Air Force Base in Montgomery, Alabama, and this is part of our formal leadership training, is you go and spend a week in there with 20 other people and their spouses. We have a spouse course to that. It's very much a team-oriented approach. And you get an opportunity to mentor them. And I loved being able to do that because the satisfaction that I took in being able to take the things that I thought were good and I thought were successful and pass them on to you. And then it's your job to say, yeah, I like this, I don't like that, this doesn't work for my style, that does work for my style. But I think the more senior you get, I was rarely providing feedback or mentoring or counseling to one of my subordinates who was in a command position, almost never about how they do their job. It was about, what do I see in the culture of your organization? What do I kind of hear from people about tone at the top as I go talk to people in your organization? You know, when I go fly in your organization, what do I feel? Because that's what they need. You know, they're trying to, what are their leadership skills? What kind of culture is that establishing? And being able to effectively mentor people on how to make adjustments at that level, I think is one of the best things you can do for somebody in terms of helping them develop.
No, absolutely. It's interesting, all the data that's out there, can't get away from it, on the generational contributions of, and like the main thing is that the thing that we have as a baby boomer is you have history that's of value, you know, that can communicate to people, here's why we did it the way we did it. Here's the decisions we made, here's what we've learned, this is where we were coming from, right? A lot of times the frustration of millennials is like, your experience doesn't mean anything to me, you know, because I'm, you know, the thing millennials don't get is that, you know, we were opinionated and clueless long before they were, right? And then the whole idea, again, of approaching not just, you know, from a generational standpoint, millennials, but anybody, they have fresh ideas. They're not burdened by, you know, our experience. They come in and they see things, it's fresh. To be able to respond to that, and you were talking about the whole gestation of an idea, to be able to say, okay, I'm not sure everything you come up with is going to be implementable, but I really still want you coming up with stuff. Right. You know, that energizes them, and there really is, you know, kernels of future greatness in that exchange. If you had one thing, like one soundbite you were going to say to somebody that was interested in becoming a more effective leader, whatever level they are in the organization, what would that be?
I think I would go back to the very first thing that we talked about. When you find somebody that you really respect, somebody that inspires you, somebody that motivates you, somebody that clearly you trust, is watch them very closely and figure out, okay, what are they doing that makes me feel this way?
Yeah.
And realizing that as you move up, that the reputation you have as a leader is not going to be built very much on what you say. It's going to be built on the observations that people have of you when you're not really paying attention. And that's why I saw you as a good leader. And so I think taking every opportunity to actually stop. A lot of people in the military keep journals, and a lot of what they're writing down is not only good stuff, but I also say, hey, everybody can serve as an example if only as a bad example.
Yeah.
There's things you go, I will never do this. But I think if you want to be a successful leader, watch other people around you who you respect as a leader, and no kidding, take notes and think about what fits my style and how can I leverage what I've seen to make me more successful.
Be very intentional and very conscious about what constitutes good leadership and maybe not good leadership in the context of what's going on. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Very good advice.
As they say, leadership is vague. It's one of my favorite quotes, right? As much as we try to model it, at the end of the day, you've got to have a style that works for you and makes you effective. And I think that as you get more senior, I used to tell these wing commanders, I said, on one hand, you're at a different level, like Marshall's saying, what got you here won't get you there. There's some changes, but there's other fundamental things about you, and I think the biggest one is you make pretty good decisions on less than perfect information, and that will be increasingly required of you as you get more senior. And so trusting yourself comes from those years of observing, imitating, practicing, adjusting, so that as you move up, you've got a good feel. You're confident in what your skills are, and then, like they told us as generals, when you become a general, you're a generalist. That's why you can go be the IT and cyber guy, right? And if you've got confidence in your leadership skills, then you can go do that.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, on behalf of everybody at the Center for Leadership Studies.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. Leadership is a passion of mine, and to be able to participate in something like this with somebody that's got your position in the field, in the industry, in the art is really a special opportunity.